The great chamber of the Galactic Concord stretched for miles in every direction. Its walls made of living crystal that hummed with the voices of 600 species gathered to decide the fate of humanity. Ambassador Chen Weilin stood at the central podium, her hands steady at her sides as she watched the votes appear on the crystalline walls like falling stars. Each one a rejection of everything her species had tried to build among the stars. 583 species voted yes to expel humanity from the Concord. 12 chose to abstain because they did not want to be involved in the matter. And only 5 voted against the resolution that would cast humans out of galactic civilization forever. The Thixian delegate who had written Resolution 4471 rose from her seat, her hard shell gleaming under the chamber lights as she addressed the assembly with satisfaction in her voice. "The matter is decided," she announced. "Humanity has proven itself incompatible with the values and traditions of the Galactic Concord, and they shall depart from our space within 1 standard month." Chen Weilin listened to the cheers that erupted from dozens of delegations around the chamber. Species who had grown tired of humans and their endless questions and their constant meddling in affairs. That did not concern them. She remembered the first time humans had joined the Concord 200 years ago, so full of hope and wonder at the idea of being part of something greater than themselves, eager to learn and share and build bridges between worlds that had never spoken to each other, but the galaxy had not wanted. Bridges. The colony merchants had complained that human negotiators interfered with their traditional pricing methods, even though those negotiations had prevented 3 trade wars in the last decade alone. The Varathi farmers had objected to human scientists offering suggestions about their agricultural practices, calling it cultural imperialism. Even though crop yields had doubled on every world that accepted human help, the Dasani archivists had demanded that human researchers stop asking so many questions about their ancient texts. Even though those questions had led to the recovery of knowledge thought lost for millennia, everywhere humans went, they asked why and how and what if. And the galaxy had grown weary of being questioned by a species that had only been traveling among the stars for a few short centuries. Chen Weilin stepped forward to the speaking platform, and the chamber fell silent as every eye and sensor and sensory organ turned toward her, waiting for the outburst they expected. The anger and threats and demands for reconsideration. "Very well," she said, her voice calm and clear. "We will go quietly." The silence that followed was heavier than any protest could have been. The Thixian delegate tilted her head in confusion, her antennae twitching as she tried to understand why the humans were not fighting this decision with every tool at their disposal. "You have nothing more to say?" she asked. Chen Weilin looked around the chamber at the faces of species who had once called humanity friends, allies, partners in the great work of building a civilization that spanned the stars. "What would you have me say?" She replied, "You have made your feelings clear, and we are not so arrogant as to believe we can force ourselves upon those who do not want us. So we will return to our own space and leave you to your traditions and your methods and your ways of doing things." She bowed once to the assembly, a gesture of respect that many species did not recognize but all understood on some level. "We wish you well," she said. And then she walked out of the chamber without looking back. Within a week, human ships began departing from every station and world throughout Concord space, their engines carrying them toward the distant corner of the galaxy, where Earth and its colonies waited. Embassies that had stood for 2 centuries closed their doors, and human diplomats packed their belongings and said goodbye to colleagues who suddenly realized they had never learned anything about human customs or culture or what humans did when they were not working. Trade agreements that had generated wealth for dozens of species were terminated with polite messages thanking all parties for their cooperation and wishing them prosperity in future endeavors, research, partnerships that had led to breakthroughs in medicine and engineering and art were dissolved, and human scientists returned their shared data and deleted their access codes and left behind only the knowledge they had already contributed. Communication buoys that had connected human space to the Concorde network were deactivated one by one, and the familiar chatter of human voices on diplomatic channels faded into static and then into nothing at all. By the end of the month, it was as if humanity had never existed among the stars. The galaxy breathed a collective sigh of relief at the silence. The Kalani merchants celebrated by raising their prices without interference, and the Varathi farmers returned to their traditional methods without outside advice, and the Dasani archivists locked their libraries against curious outsiders who might ask inconvenient questions. The Thixian delegate received commendations from her government for her service in removing the human nuisance from galactic affairs, and she gave speeches about the importance of preserving tradition against the chaos of change. But in quiet moments, when the celebrations had ended and the speeches had been forgotten, some delegates found themselves wondering about the silence that now filled the spaces where human voices had once been. The human mediator, who had always been available to help resolve shipping disputes, was gone, and no one had been assigned to take her place. The human engineer who had maintained the backup systems for the Dasani archives had returned to Earth, and his detailed notes were written in a language no one else could read. The human ambassador, who had always known exactly what to say to calm tensions between rival species, had departed, and the channels she had used remained empty. But these were small concerns, easily dismissed by species who had more important matters to consider than the absence of a single troublesome race. Humanity was gone, and the galaxy could finally return to the way things had always been done. Chen Weilin stood on the observation deck of the last human ship to leave Concorde space, watching the stars that had once seemed so welcoming grow cold and distant behind her. "Do you think they will miss us?" asked Raid, a young man who had spent his entire career working toward a future where humans and aliens built something wonderful together. Chen Weilin did not answer for a long time. "They will learn what our silence means," she finally said, "and I hope, for their sake, that the lesson is not too painful." The ship crossed the border into human space, and behind it, the communication channel closed for the last time. The galaxy did not notice, not yet. 3 years passed since the humans had departed from Concorde space, and the galaxy continued to turn as it always had, with trade ships moving between worlds and diplomats arguing in chambers and scientists studying the mysteries of the universe. But something had changed. Something so small that most species did not notice it until the problems began to grow too large to ignore. The Kalani Merchant Guild was the first to notice that their shipping disputes had increased by 340% since the human expulsion, and their analysts had spent months trying to understand why their carefully balanced trade networks were suddenly falling apart. They reviewed their contracts and examined their routes and questioned their captains, but they could not find any single cause for the chaos that was spreading through their operations. It was a junior clerk who finally discovered the truth while searching through old records from the time when humans still walked among them. There was a human mediator stationed at every major trade hub. She reported to her superiors. She did not have any official title or authority, but whenever there was a dispute between merchants, she would talk to both sides and ask questions and suggest compromises that neither party had considered. The senior merchants dismissed her findings because they refused to believe that a single human could have made any difference in the sophisticated operations of the greatest trading civilization in the galaxy. But the disputes continued to multiply, and the cost of litigation began to drain. resources that should have been spent on expansion and innovation 5 years after the expulsion. The Varathi hegemony sent an urgent request to the Concord for agricultural assistance because their farming worlds were experiencing failures that threatened to starve billions of their citizens. Their soil had become depleted in ways that their traditional methods could not address, and their crops were dying in fields that had been productive for thousands of years. The Concord dispatched experts from a dozen species to study the problem, but none of them could understand what had gone wrong with techniques that had worked for so many generations. A Varathi farmer named Kethro remembered the human scientist who had visited his world a decade ago. A woman with dirt under her fingernails who had knelt in his fields and asked questions about how his ancestors had cared for the land. She had talked about something called crop rotation, which meant growing different plants in different seasons to keep the soil healthy. And she had explained how certain plants could put nutrients back into the ground that other plants had taken out. Kethro had listened politely and then ignored her advice because his methods had worked for his father and his grandfather and all the generations before them. Now his fields were barren, and he did not know how to reach the human scientist who might have been able to help him save his world. 7 years after the expulsion, the Great Archive of Thesan IV suffered a catastrophic failure that destroyed 40,000 years of cultural heritage in a single terrible moment. The backup systems that should have protected their precious data had not been maintained, since the human archivist who designed them had been forced to leave, and no one else had understood the complex redundancies she had built into the network. The Dasani wept for the loss of poetry and music and stories that could never be recovered, and they cursed the human who had failed to train anyone else to maintain her systems before she departed. They did not remember that they had refused her offers to teach them because they had not wanted to admit that an alien understood their technology better than they did across the galaxy. Similar stories were unfolding in ways both large and small. A research station that had relied on human engineers to maintain its life support systems experienced a near-fatal malfunction that would have been prevented by a simple inspection routine that no one remembered to perform. A diplomatic summit between two rival species collapsed into accusations and threats because there was no neutral party present who could translate not just their words but their intentions and concerns. A hospital on a frontier world lost patients to a disease that human doctors had already cured because the medical database had not been updated since the last human researcher had been expelled. The Concord did not connect these events because they happened in different sectors and affected different species and seemed to have nothing to do with each other. They were isolated incidents, unfortunate but manageable, the kind of problems that any civilization must expect to face from time to time. The Thixian delegate continued to give speeches about the wisdom of removing humans from galactic affairs, although she noticed that fewer delegates attended each time she spoke. She told herself that they were simply busy with other matters, and she refused to consider the possibility that they were beginning to wonder if her great victory had been a terrible mistake in human space. Chen Wei-Lin received reports about the trouble spreading through the Concord, and she felt no satisfaction at being proven right about the consequences of expulsion. She had not wanted the galaxy to suffer, and she had hoped that the other species would find ways to fill the roles that humans had quietly occupied for so long. But humans had spent 2 centuries weaving themselves into the fabric of galactic civilization in ways that no one had noticed until the threads began to unravel. They had not done it for power or recognition or any grand strategic purpose. They had done it because that was simply what humans did. connecting and bridging and asking questions until problems that seemed impossible became puzzles that could be solved. Now the galaxy was learning to live without those connections. And the lessons were harder than anyone had expected. The silence where human voices had once been was growing louder every day, filled with the sounds of disputes that no one could resolve, and systems that no one could maintain, and knowledge that no one could recover. But the worst was yet to come in the dark spaces between the stars. Something was moving toward the galaxy. Something that had destroyed civilizations before and would destroy them again. Unless someone could unite the fractured species of the Concord against a common threat, the humans had been the ones who knew how to unite people who had nothing in common except their need for survival, and the humans were gone. The swarm came from beyond the galactic rim in the 15th year of humanity's absence, their ships appearing in sensor ranges like a spreading stain across the darkness of space. They were not a species in any way the Concord understood, not beings with culture or history or any desire except the consumption of resources and the expansion of their numbers across every world they touched. The first reports described ships made of living metal that changed shape as they moved, vessels that seemed to grow larger as they devoured asteroids and moons and anything else that contained the raw materials they needed to reproduce. The Rillian Confederacy sent the first distress signal when the swarm's outriders entered their territory and began stripping the outer planets of their system. Without any attempt at communication or negotiation, we request immediate military assistance from all Concord members, the Rillian ambassador announced in the Great Chamber, his voice trembling with fear as images of the approaching fleet filled the crystalline walls. These invaders have destroyed 3 of our colony worlds in less than a week, and our defenses cannot hold them back. The Concord had protocols for exactly this situation, procedures developed over thousands of years for coordinating the military forces of hundreds of species against any threat that endangered the peace of the galaxy. The Thixian delegate called for an emergency vote on intervention, and committees were formed to study the threat and propose responses and coordinate the logistics of moving fleets across dozens of sectors. But the committees could not agree on who should lead the response, and the proposals were amended and debated and sent back for revision. And the logistics experts discovered that their communication networks were not functioning as efficiently as they once had. 12 days passed while the Concord debated the proper procedure for responding to the swarm. On the 13th day, the Rillian ambassador stopped responding to messages because there were no more Rillians left to send them. 7 billion people died while the galaxy argued about protocols. The Thixian delegate stood in the chamber and looked at the empty seat where the Rillian ambassador had pleaded for help. And for the first time since she had written Resolution 4471, she felt the cold grip of doubt around her heart. In the old days, a human would have been running through the corridors of the Concord headquarters, pounding on doors and shouting at delegates and refusing to let bureaucracy triumph over urgency. Pounding on doors and shouting at delegates and refusing to let bureaucracy triumph over urgency. A human would have stood in the center of the chamber and demanded to know why procedure mattered more than lives, why tradition was more important than survival, why 600 species could not agree to help one of their own when the alternative was extinction. But there were no humans now, and no one else seemed willing to make that noise. The swarm moved deeper into Concord space, and more distress signals arrived, and more committees were formed, and more species died while the galaxy searched for consensus. The Morthani Federation was next. Their ancient civilization reduced to dust in less than a month, because the fleets that should have defended them were still waiting for authorization to deploy the Kristen Collective followed. Their beautiful cities consumed for the metals and minerals that made up their architecture. Their songs silenced forever because no one had come to help them sing one last time. 12 species were destroyed in 2 years. Their homeworlds stripped bare, their populations scattered or dead. Their cultures erased from the galaxy as if they had never existed. The Concord passed 47 resolutions condemning the swarm's aggression and calling for coordinated action against the threat. But none of those resolutions included anything that might actually stop the killing on the floor of the Great Chamber. After another vote that achieved nothing except the feeling that something had been done, the Thixian delegate was heard to whisper the question that many were thinking but few dared to speak. Where are the humans when you need them? No one laughed and no one answered, because everyone knew that the humans were exactly where the Concord had sent them. Far away in their own space, where they could not interfere with the traditions and methods and ways of doing things that were now leading the galaxy toward destruction. The delegate looked at her hands. The same hands that had signed Resolution 4471 with such confidence and pride. And she wondered how many deaths those hands had caused. She had thought she was protecting the galaxy from change, from the chaos of human meddling and human questions and human refusal to accept that some things were simply the way they were. She had not understood that change was not always the enemy, that sometimes the chaos of questions was the only thing standing. Between civilization and extinction, the swarm continued to advance, and the Concord continued to debate, and species continued to die. And somewhere in the distant reaches of human space, Chen Weilin watched the reports with a grief that grew heavier with each passing day. We could help them, her aide said. The same young man who had stood beside her on the observation deck 15 years ago. Now older and harder, but still hoping that the universe could be better than it seemed. We have the ships and the technology and the will to fight. Chen Weilin shook her head slowly, the weight of 15 years of silence pressing down on her shoulders like the gravity of a dying star. They expelled us, she said. They told us we were not wanted, that our questions were annoying, and our methods were wrong, and our presence was a burden they could not bear. But people are dying. Yes, and they will continue to die until the Concord learns to save itself or admits that it cannot. Chen Weilin turned away from the screens that showed world after world being consumed by the darkness. We cannot force them to accept our help, and we cannot save people who do not want to be saved. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely true. Humans had never been good at watching others suffer without trying to help, even when their help was unwanted, even when their efforts were rejected, even when the cost of caring was higher than the cost of looking away. The silence between human space and the Concord remained unbroken, but it was growing thinner with each passing day, stretched by the weight of all the deaths that might have been prevented if someone had been willing to ask. The questions that no one else would ask, and in the great chamber of the Concord, where 600 species had once gathered to debate the future of the galaxy, the empty seats of the fallen were beginning to outnumber the occupied ones. The Thixian delegate looked at those empty seats and made a decision that would change everything. She would go to the humans herself and ask them to forgive what could not be forgiven. She would beg if she had to. It was the only hope the galaxy had left. 17 delegations had already tried to reach human space, each one carrying messages of regret and promises of reconciliation and requests for the assistance that only humans could provide. 17 delegations had been turned away at the border, not with weapons or threats, but with a simple message that arrived on the same frequency every time. You cast us aside, and we accepted your judgment, and we wish you well. The words were polite and formal and completely empty of the warmth that human voices had once carried. And each delegation returned to the Concord with the same report of failure. The humans were not angry, and they were not seeking revenge. and they were not interested in negotiations or reparations or any of the things that the Concord was prepared to offer. They had simply stopped caring about what happened beyond their borders. The Fixian delegate watched the last delegation return with the same message, and she understood that the Concord's approach would never work because the Concord was still trying to treat humans as a problem to be solved rather than a people to be understood. She resigned from her position the next morning, surrendering all the honors and privileges she had earned through her long service to the Concord. Her colleagues thought she had lost her mind when she announced that she would travel to human space alone, without credentials or authority or any of the protections that a diplomatic mission would normally provide. "They will kill you," her aide warned her, "or worse. They will simply ignore you like they have ignored everyone else." The Fixian delegate looked at the young officer who had served her faithfully for so many years, and she felt a strange sense of peace settling over her heart. "Then I will die knowing that I tried to fix what I broke," she said. "And that is more than I deserve after what I have done." She traveled in a small ship with no weapons and no escort, crossing the empty space between Concord territory and the human border where the communication buoys had been dark for 15 years. The journey took 3 weeks, and she spent every moment of it preparing what she would say if she was given the chance to speak. She did not prepare a speech about the swarm or the dying species or the desperate need for human assistance. Instead, she prepared an apology. She arrived at the human border and transmitted her message on the frequency that had rejected so many delegations before her. "I am the one who wrote Resolution 4471, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that coiled in her stomachs. "I am the one who convinced the Concord to cast you out, and I am the one who celebrated when you left." She paused, letting the silence stretch across the void between her ship and whatever human sensors might be watching. "I am here to apologize, not on behalf of the Concord, because they do not deserve to apologize, but on behalf of myself, because I was wrong." There was no response, and for 3 days she sat in her ship at the edge of human space, waiting and hoping and preparing herself for the possibility that her journey had been for nothing. On the 4th day, a human ship appeared from behind a moon that had seemed empty on her sensors, its hull sleek and strange in ways that suggested 15 years of development without any Concord influence. The ship did not hail her or demand identification or threaten her with weapons. It simply moved to a position in front of her vessel and transmitted a single message: "Follow us." The Fixian delegate followed the human ship through the barrier of sensor scrambling technology that had hidden human space from the galaxy, and she emerged on the other side to find something she had not expected. Human space was not a fortress or a wasteland or a collection of bitter refugees hiding from the galaxy that had rejected them. It was beautiful stations orbited around stars that had been harvested for energy without being destroyed, their structures grown rather than built, covered in gardens and parks and places where people could walk under artificial skies. Ships moved between worlds with a grace that spoke of technologies the Concord had never developed, their engines silent and efficient, and somehow kinder to the space they traveled through. And everywhere she looked, she saw humans living and working and laughing, not as a species in exile, but as a civilization that had found its own way forward without the galaxy that had cast them aside. The human ship led her to Mars, the red world that humans had been trying to transform into a garden for centuries. And she saw that they had finally succeeded. Green covered the surface where there had once been only rust and rock, and water flowed in rivers that had been carved by human hands and human determination. She was escorted to a garden on the surface, where roses grew in soil that have never known anything but human care. And she was told to wait. An hour passed, and then another. And then a door opened and an old woman walked into the garden with the slow, careful steps of someone who had lived long enough to know that hurrying rarely made anything better. Chen Weilin was 93 years old. Her hair white and her face lined with the marks of a life spent caring about things that most people preferred to ignore. But her eyes were sharp and clear. And when she looked at the Thixian delegate, there was no hatred in them. Only a tired kind of curiosity. "You came alone?" Chen Weilin said, settling into a chair across from her visitor. "Without authority or credentials, or any of the things your people usually hide behind. I did not deserve to hide," the Thixian delegate replied. "Not after what I did." Chen Weilin nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied some questions she had been asking herself for a very long time. "Do you know why we left so easily?" she asked. The Thixian delegate bowed her head, because this was the question she had been asking herself ever since the first species fell to the swarm. "I thought you would fight," she admitted. "I thought you would argue and negotiate and refuse to accept the judgment of the Concord. We considered it," Chen Weilin said, pouring tea from a pot that had been waiting on the table between them. "But we realized something important while we were considering our options." She offered a cup to her visitor, and the Thixian delegate accepted it even though she did not know how to drink human beverages. "We could not make you value us," Chen Weilin continued. "We could only show you what our absence meant, and hope that the lesson would not be too painful." The Thixian delegate looked down at the cup in her hands. The liquid inside dark and strange and somehow comforting. "The lesson has been very painful," she said. "Billions have died because we did not know how to do the things that humans did without thinking." "Yes," Chen Weilin said, and there was no satisfaction in her voice. "Only grief. That was not our intention. But it was always a possibility." She set down her own cup and looked at her visitor with eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. "You want to know if we will come back." It was not a question, but the Thixian delegate answered anyway. "I want to know if you can forgive us," she said. "Even if you cannot help us, even if we have destroyed any chance of rebuilding what we lost. I need to know if forgiveness is possible." Chen Weilin was silent for a long time, and the Thixian delegate watched her face and tried to read the thoughts moving behind those ancient human eyes. "The humans who left the Concord are not the same as the humans who sit here now," Chen Weilin finally said. 15 years of building our own path has changed us in ways we are still discovering." She stood slowly, and despite her age, there was something strong and unbreakable in the way she held herself. "But we have not changed so much that we will watch the galaxy burn." The Thixian delegate felt something shift in her heart. A weight that had been crushing her since the first reports of the swarm, beginning to lift from her shoulders. "You will help us?" Chen Weilin looked down at her visitor, and for the first time, there was something warm in her expression. "We will help you," she said, "but not as mediators working in the shadows. Not as voices that can be dismissed or expelled when you grow tired of our questions." She extended her hand in the human gesture that the Thixian delegate had learned meant welcome and trust and the beginning of something new. "This time, you will acknowledge what we are." The Thixian delegate took the offered hand, her hard shell against soft human skin. Two species touching for the first time in 15 years. "What are you?" she asked. Chen Weilin smiled. "We are the ones who care," she said, "even when it costs us everything." And for the first time since Resolution 471, the Thixian delegate believed that the galaxy might survive. The human fleet emerged from the border of their space, like a sunrise breaking over a world that had known only darkness. Their ships moving in formations that the Concord had never seen. Efficient and graceful and somehow welcoming despite the weapons they carried, Chen Weilin stood on the bridge of the flagship. watching the stars that had once rejected her species grow closer with each passing hour. Beside her, the Thixian delegate who had traveled so far to find forgiveness watched the same stars with eyes that saw them differently now. "Your ships are beautiful," she said, her voice carrying wonder that she had not felt since she was young, and the universe still seemed full of possibilities. Chen Weilin nodded, but her attention was focused on the tactical displays showing the swarms advance through Concord territory. "We had 15 years to develop them without interference," she replied. "Without committees telling us what was possible and what was not. Without traditions limiting what we could imagine." The Thixian delegate heard the words that Chen Weilin did not say. The acknowledgement that humanity's exile had not been entirely a loss. That some part of them had grown stronger in the silence between the stars. "I'm sorry," the Thixian delegate said, though she had already said it 100 times since leaving the garden on Mars. "I am sorry for all of it." Chen Weilin finally turned to look at her, and there was something in her expression that might have been the beginning of peace. "I know," she said, "and that is why I am here." The human fleet arrived in Concord space to find a galaxy that had been transformed by fear and loss. Species that had once argued over trade routes and traditions now huddled together on their remaining worlds, waiting for the swarm to find them. The great chamber of the Concord was nearly empty when Chen Weilin walked through its doors for the first time in 15 years. Her footsteps echoing in halls that had once been filled with the voices of 600 species. Only 300 remained, and many of those were refugees from worlds that no longer existed. The delegates who had survived looked at the human ambassador with expressions that ranged from hope to shame to something that might have been relief. "We expelled you," the speaker of the chamber said. An ancient colony whose trading empire had been reduced to a handful of ships fleeing from system to system. "We told you that you were not wanted, that your questions were annoying, and your methods were wrong." Chen Weilin stood at the central podium where she had accepted humanity's expulsion so many years ago, and she looked at the faces of species who had learned too late what her people had tried to teach them. "You did," she agreed. "And we left because we believed that forcing ourselves upon you would only make things worse." She paused, letting the silence stretch through the chamber like a bridge across the gap between past and future. "We were wrong about that," she continued. "We should have stayed and fought. Not with weapons, but with words, with questions, with the stubborn refusal to give up on people who had given up on us." The chamber was completely still, every delegate waiting to hear what the humans would demand in exchange for their help. Chen Weilin smiled, and it was a sad smile that carried the weight of all the years she had spent watching the galaxy destroy itself from a distance. "We are not here to punish you," she said. "We are not here to demand reparations or privileges or acknowledgement of our superiority." She looked around the chamber at the empty seats that would never be filled again, at the species that had been lost to the swarm while the Concord debated and deliberated, and followed procedures that had never been designed for survival. "We are here because this is what humans do," she said. "We connect, we bridge, we ask questions until we find answers that no one else thought to look for. And we never stop caring about the people around us, even when they hurt us, even when they cast us aside, even when caring costs us everything we have." She extended her hands toward the chamber, palms open, offering rather than demanding. "We forgive you," she said. "Not because you deserve it, not because you have earned it, but because holding on to anger serves no one, and there is too much work to be done for any of us to waste time on grudges." The battle against the swarm took 3 years, and it was the hardest thing the galaxy had ever accomplished. Human strategists worked alongside Concord commanders, translating not just languages, but entire ways of thinking, building bridges between species that had never learned to trust each other. Human engineers repaired systems that had been broken for decades, asking questions that no one else had thought to ask, finding solutions that no one else had thought to try. Human diplomats mediated disputes that had festered since before the expulsion, refusing to accept that some conflicts were simply impossible to resolve, pushing and questioning and caring until ancient enemies found reasons to become allies, and human soldiers fought beside Concord warriors, dying in battles that protected worlds they had never seen, giving their lives for species that had voted to cast them out of the galaxy. When the swarm was finally defeated, driven back beyond the galactic rim by a united force that would have been impossible without human persistence, the galaxy had been transformed. The great chamber of the Concord was rebuilt. And when the delegates gathered for the first session of the new era, they found that the seating had been rearranged. Humanity no longer sat in the back rows reserved for junior members. A new seat had been created at the very center of the chamber, a position that had never existed before, reserved for the species that had been recognized as essential to the survival of all the others. Chen Wei-Lin did not live to see that day, but her successor took the seat in her name, carrying the legacy of a woman who had spent her whole life trying to help others understand what it meant to be human. The Thixian delegate who had written Resolution 4471 stood at the podium to introduce the humans to their new position, her voice strong despite the years that had passed since her journey to the human border. "We cast them aside," she said, "and we learned too late what their silence meant." She looked at the human delegates, young people who had been children during the exile, who had grown up knowing only that the galaxy had rejected their ancestors and then begged for their help. It meant that the connections we had taken for granted were gone. She continued, "The bridges we had not noticed were broken. The questions we had not valued were no longer being asked." She bowed to the human delegation, a gesture of respect that her species had never offered to anyone. "Never again," she said. "Never again will we forget that caring is not weakness, that questions are not threats, that the species who talks too much and forms too many committees and refuses to accept that some things cannot be changed is the species that saves us when nothing else can." The chamber erupted in applause. 600 species acknowledging the truth that it cost so many lives to learn, and in human space. In the garden on Mars, where roses still grew in soil that had once been barren red dust, a statue had been erected in honor of Chen Wei-Lin. The inscription at its base was simple, just 3 words that captured everything humanity had tried to teach the galaxy for 300 years. "We cared anyway." It was the most human epitaph imaginable, and it was exactly what the galaxy had needed to hear. The silence was over. The talking had begun again, and this time, everyone was listening.